The sound of it carried down the hallway. Not loud. Not the kind of thing that makes a room go silent all at once. Just a sharp, dry crack, the back of a hand against a jaw, and then nothing. Like the air itself didn't know what to do next. Calvin Adeyemi didn't fall. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even turn around right away. He just stood there in the middle of the Hartwell Regional Medical Centre admissions corridor, holding a manila folder against his side, and let the moment pass through him like a cold wind through an open door. The man who had done it, a senior administrator named Roger Peel, was already walking away, shaking his head, muttering something to the younger man beside him, who laughed a little too quickly, the way people do when they want to seem like they belong to something. Nobody said a word. There were 7 other people in that hallway, 2 nurses at the station, a porter with a supply cart, a woman in scrubs who had frozen mid-step near the elevator, a security guard by the front entrance who had looked up from his phone, clocked what happened, and looked back down again. None of them said a word. Calvin picked up the folder he dropped, straightened the papers inside, and then he walked, calmly, unhurried, to the end of the hallway and turned left toward the administrative wing. That was a Tuesday morning in late February. The sky outside was the color of old concrete, and the hospital smelled like it always did. Floor cleaner and recycled air and something underneath that no amount of cleaning ever quite reaches. It was Calvin Adeyemi's first day at Hartwell. He had driven up from Toronto the night before, 4.5 hours on the 400, the last stretch along back roads, where the snow was still thick on the shoulders and the towns appeared suddenly out of darkness. A gas station, a diner, a cluster of houses with their porch lights on, and then disappeared just as fast. He had not told anyone he was coming. That wasn't unusual for him. Calvin had a habit of arriving quietly, watching carefully, and saying very little until he understood exactly what he was looking at. His colleagues in Toronto, the ones who knew him well, called it patience. The ones who didn't know him well called it arrogance, or aloofness, or any number of words that people reach for when someone refuses to perform openness on demand. He was 41 years old. He had spent the last 12 years working in hospital administration, the last 5 as Deputy Director of Patient Services at St. Vincent's in downtown Toronto. Before that, a Master's in Health Policy from Queen's. Before that, a decade of work that nobody at Hartwell knew anything about and that Calvin had no particular interest in discussing. He checked into a motel on the edge of town and ate a late dinner at a diner where the waitress called him Han and brought him coffee without being asked. He left a good tip and walked back to his room and sat on the edge of the bed for a while, not reading, not watching television, just sitting. In the morning, he drove to Hartwell Regional. He did not go to the administrative parking lot. He parked in visitors' parking, paid the machine, and walked in through the front entrance like anyone else. He had been watching the place for exactly 4 minutes, standing near the reception desk, taking in the layout, the traffic patterns, the body language of staff passing through, when Roger Peel came around the corner. Roger Peel was 53 and had worked at Hartwell Regional for 22 years. He was not technically the most senior person in the building, but he operated as though he were. He had the walk of a man who had never been told no by anyone he respected, and the habit of filling silence with his own voice before anyone else could. He saw Calvin standing near the reception desk, a tall black man in a dark coat, holding a folder, looking at the hospital board on the wall, and made an instant, unconsidered decision about what he was looking at. "Excuse me." He said it the way people say it when they don't actually mean excuse me. "Vorndern access is through the side entrance. You'll need to check in with procurement." Calvin looked at him. "I'm not a vendor." Patient family. Visiting hours don't start until 10. I'm not visiting a patient. Peel's expression shifted slightly, not toward uncertainty, toward impatience. Then what exactly are you doing standing here? Looking at your hospital, Calvin said. There was a pause, the kind that gets filled badly. Listen, Peel said, and his voice had dropped half a register into something that wanted to sound authoritative. I don't know who you are, or what you think you're doing, but this is a working medical facility. If you don't have business here, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. I have business here, Calvin said. Right. Peel laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and then he did something that nobody in that hallway would be able to adequately explain afterward. He reached out and shoved Calvin's shoulder, hard enough to knock the folder out of his grip. Papers scattered across the floor, and as Calvin bent to pick them up, Peel said something that the woman in scrubs near the elevator would later repeat word for word to two different investigators. He said, "People like you don't belong in places like this. Pick your stuff up and get out." Then he turned to the younger man beside him and said, "Come on, let's go." And they went. The woman in scrubs was named Dr. Amara Solis, and she was 3 years into her residency at Hartwell, and she had been in this building long enough to know that what she had just witnessed was not unusual. That was the most disturbing part. It wasn't a shock. It was a confirmation. She watched Calvin gather his papers from the floor. She started to say something. She would think about this later, the moment she started and stopped, but he looked up at her before she could, and something in his expression made her stay quiet. Not the look of someone who needed help. The look of someone who was paying very close attention and preferred not to be interrupted. He stood up, straightened the papers, and walked down the hallway. Dr. Solis stood by the elevator for another few seconds after he'd gone. Then she pressed the button and went up to the 3rd floor and didn't say anything to anyone for the rest of the morning. Calvin spent the first 2 hours of that morning walking the hospital. Not as an inspection, not with a clipboard or a checklist, just walking, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, pausing in corridors, sitting for 10 minutes in the family waiting area outside the surgical ward, watching people come in and out, listening to how staff spoke to patients, noticing which signs were outdated, which hand sanitizers dispensers were empty, which nurses looked exhausted, versus which ones looked checked out. He stopped in the cafeteria and bought a coffee and sat at a table near the window and watched the room for 20 minutes. A man at the next table, an orderly, still in his scrubs, eating a sandwich, glanced at him a few times. "You knew?" the orderly said eventually. "First day," Calvin said. "Department?" Calvin thought about it for a moment. "Administration. Admin." The orderly nodded slowly. "Hope you know what you're walking into." "What am I walking into?" The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This place has been running the same way for a long time. Some people like it that way." "And you?" The orderly looked out the window at the parking lot. "I just work here." He finished his sandwich and left. Calvin sat with his coffee and looked out the same window for a while, before he got up and went back inside. The administrative wing was on the 2nd floor, past the records department, and a set of double doors with a keypad lock. Calvin buzzed and gave his name to the receptionist, who looked at her computer, looked at him, looked at her computer again, and then said she'd be right back. She was gone for 4 minutes. When she came back, she was accompanied by a woman named Helen Farrow, who was the office coordinator and who had clearly been told to manage this situation without being told what the situation actually was. "Mr. Adeyemi," she said, with the careful warmth of someone handling something they don't fully understand. "We weren't," I mean, we thought you weren't arriving until Thursday. I moved it up, Calvin said. Of course. Of course. She was already nodding, already moving. Let me just. I'll get. Office is ready. We just need to. Can I get you a coffee? I have one, he said, holding up his cup. She smiled and led him down the hall. His office was in the corner. Big windows facing east, a view of the parking lot, and the tree line beyond it. The desk had been cleared and cleaned. Someone had put a small plant on the windowsill, which he noticed and appreciated. He sat down, set his folder on the desk, looked out the window for a moment. Then he took out his phone and made 3 calls. The first was to the Regional Health Authority in Toronto. The second was to the hospital's external audit firm. The third was to a woman named Sandra Park, who was a labor relations specialist, and who had worked with Calvin for, and who asked, when she picked up, "How bad is it?" "I've been here 4 hours," Calvin said. "That's not an answer." "I know," he said. "I'll call you Thursday." Over the next 2 weeks, Calvin Adeyemi said very little. He attended the senior leadership meetings and listened. He read every report that had been filed in the last 3 years. He walked the hospital at different times of day. Early morning, late evening, once at 2 in the morning, when he told the overnight charge nurse he was having trouble sleeping and just wanted to get a sense of the rhythm of the place. He ate in the cafeteria most days. He learned the names of the orderlies and the porters and the ward clerks. He stopped in the hallway when someone looked like they needed a moment and asked, simply, how they were doing. He did not attend Roger Peel's team meetings. When Peel stopped by his office one afternoon to introduce himself, a performance of confidence that required, Calvin noticed, 2 attempts before the man actually knocked. Calvin shook his hand, offered him a seat, and asked him 3 questions about departmental budget allocation that Peel could not fully answer. Peel left the meeting 15 minutes later, looking as though he'd had a conversation he hadn't been prepared for. He told a colleague that afternoon, "I don't know what that guy's here for, but he doesn't know what he's doing." The colleague nodded. He had heard this kind of thing before from Roger. It usually meant the opposite. Dr. Amara Solis ran into Calvin again on a Wednesday morning in early March, near the vending machines on the 3rd floor. She almost walked past him. Then she stopped. "You're still here," she said. He looked at her. "I am." She hesitated. "I saw what happened in the hallway on your first day." "I know," he said. "I didn't. I should have said something." "What would you have said?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know." "Something." She looked at the vending machine. "Does anyone know who you actually are? What you're actually doing here?" "A few people," Calvin said. "More by Thursday." She frowned. "Why Thursday?" He pressed the button for his selection, waited for it to drop, picked it up. "Department heads meeting," he said. 3 o'clock. He walked back toward the stairwell. She stood there for a moment, watching him go. Then she went back to her rounds and spent the rest of the day with a feeling she couldn't quite name. Something between anticipation and dread. The Thursday meeting was held in the 2nd floor boardroom. It had a long table, blue chairs, a whiteboard at one end, and windows that overlooked the ambulance bay. 14 people filed in over a 10-minute window. Department heads, senior administrators, the chief of medicine, the director of nursing. Roger Peel arrived with his usual ease, taking his habitual seat near the middle of the table, setting his phone face up in front of him. Helen Farrow was already in the room when they arrived. She did not look at anyone in particular. Calvin came in at 3 o'clock exactly and closed the door behind him. He stood at the front of the room for a moment. He did not introduce himself. He did not make small talk. He set a folder on the table, looked around the room once, and then said, My name is Calvin Adeyemi. I was appointed Executive Director of Patient Services and Operational Reform for the Hartwell Regional Health Network, effect February 18th. I've been on site since the 18th. I've spent the last 2 weeks reviewing operations, financial performance, staffing patterns, patient outcomes data, and internal complaints records. We have a lot to discuss. The room was very quiet. Calvin opened his folder. Let's start with the complaints. There were 47 formal complaints filed against staff members at Hartwell Regional in the previous calendar year. 31 of them had been filed, reviewed by a committee, and closed with no action taken. 9 were still technically open, meaning unresolved, meaning sitting in a folder somewhere, meaning ignored. Calvin read the numbers without editorial, just the numbers. And then he read 3 of the complaints aloud, not summarized, not paraphrased, but read directly, in the words of the people who had written them. Nobody in that room looked comfortable. A few people looked at Roger Peel. Peel was looking at the table. I've also reviewed the staffing incident log, Calvin continued. There are patterns here that I want to be clear about. Not allegations. Patterns. Documented. Time-stamped. Witnessed. He set down the folder. On my first morning in this building, he said, I was physically handled and verbally threatened in the main corridor, in front of multiple witnesses, by someone in this room. Silence. The kind that has weight to it. I want to be clear that I am not raising this for personal reasons. I'm raising it because it is an example of a pattern, not an exception to one. And because the people in this organization who do not sit at this table experience versions of that pattern regularly, with no mechanism for consequence and no reasonable expectation that anything will change. Roger Peel's jaw had tightened. He started to say something. Mr. Peel, Calvin said without looking at him, you'll have an opportunity to respond through the formal process, which begins Monday. Peel closed his mouth. The formal process did begin on Monday. There were interviews conducted by Sandra Park and a colleague from the Labor Relations Office. There were written statements from 7 witnesses, including the porter who had been in the hallway, one of the nurses at the station, and Dr. Amara Solis, who wrote 3 pages and signed her name at the bottom without hesitation. Roger Peel retained a lawyer. His lawyer sent a letter. Calvin's office received the letter, acknowledged it, and continued. It took 6 weeks. At the end of 6 weeks, Roger Peel was dismissed from his position at Hartwell Regional Medical Centre. His dismissal was for cause. He would not receive a severance package. The details were confidential, as these things are, but they were thorough, and they were documented, and they were not reversible. On the day it was finalized, Calvin sat in his corner office and looked out the window at the parking lot and the tree line, and didn't say very much. Helen Farrow knocked on the door around 4 o'clock and set a coffee on his desk without being asked. How are you doing? She said. Calvin thought about it. Fine, he said, and then, after a pause, tired. She nodded and left him to it. The changes at Hartwell came slowly, the way real changes do. A new complaints process, an anonymous reporting system, digital, accessible from any hospital computer, a monthly review of staffing incidents that was now attended by the Director of Nursing and the Chief of Medicine, and was not optional, a weekly meeting between Calvin's office and the frontline staff representatives, the ones who actually knew what was happening on the ground, whose names never appeared in the administrative reports, who had been saying the same things for years to people who weren't listening. Dr. Amara Solis sat in on one of those early meetings, not in any official capacity, just there, listening, making notes. Calvin noticed her there the 2nd week and the 3rd, and eventually he asked her if she wanted to be formally included. She said yes. The orderly from the cafeteria, his name was Jerome Adeyemi, and he had worked at Hartwell for 11 years. Stopped Calvin in the hallway one afternoon in April. "You know, people are talking," Jerome said. "About what?" "About the changes. About Peel." He looked at Calvin directly. "A lot of people here didn't think anything was going to change." "I know," Calvin said. "You knew that going in?" "I've worked in hospitals for a long time," Calvin said. "People stop believing things will change because they've been given enough reasons to stop believing. That doesn't mean the reasons are right." Jerome was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you say anything that morning, when he hit you?" Calvin thought about it. Not performing the thought, but actually thinking. "Because I needed to know what I was dealing with," he said. "If I had said something right then, it would have been one incident, one complaint, one process. And then it would have been managed, contained, and we'd have moved on and nothing would have been different. By waiting, Calvin said, I had documentation, patterns, witnesses, a case for systemic change instead of one man's bad behavior." Jerome looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "That must have been hard." "Yes," Calvin said simply, "it was." In May, Calvin flew back to Toronto for a weekend. His sister lived there, and they had dinner on Friday night at a restaurant they'd been going to since they were teenagers. A small place that hadn't changed in 20 years. Still the same menu, same booths, same smell of the kitchen coming through whenever the door swung open. She asked him how the new role was going. He told her the outline of it, not everything, the important parts. She listened, and when he was done, she said, "Were you scared that first day?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not scared," he said, "angry, and then deliberate." "What's the difference?" He looked at his coffee. "Anger tells you something's wrong. Deliberate is what you do about it." She nodded slowly. "Mom would have said that." He smiled, and it reached his eyes, and for a moment, he looked like someone who had set something down that he'd been carrying for a long time. "She would have," he said. The snow was gone by late April. By May, there were green shoots along the tree line, Calvin could see from his office window, and the ambulance bay in the mornings had that particular quality of light that only happens for a few weeks in a northern spring. Low and clear and almost gentle. He kept a notebook on his desk that he wrote in sometimes, not formally, just observations. Things he noticed, things he wanted to remember. He wrote, "One morning in the third week of May, the building is starting to feel different, not fixed, but different, like something opened a window." He didn't write anything after that for a while. He just sat with the notebook open and looked out the window at the light on the parking lot and the tree line beyond it, and thought about all the people in the building below him. The nurses, the orderlies, the residents, the ward clerks, the porters, who came to work every day and did their jobs and deserved, at minimum, to be treated as though their presence in this building was not something that needed to be explained or justified or earned. He thought about the hallway on his first day, the sound of it, the silence after. And then he thought about Jerome Adeyemi's face in the cafeteria, the morning they met. This place has been running the same way for a long time. It had. But that was the thing about the first day. It was also the first day of something else. What happens when the people in power have spent so long counting on silence that they've forgotten silence has a limit? What happens when the person they underestimated already knew, before they walked through the door, exactly what kind of place they were walking into? Calvin Adeyemi walked into Hartwell Regional Medical Centre on a Tuesday morning in February with a folder under his arm and nothing to prove and everything to change. He just didn't do it the way anyone expected. I keep thinking about the moment Calvin, Pick those papers up off the floor. Not the slap. Not Roger Peel walking away. Not the silence of 7 people who watched and said nothing. I keep thinking about the few seconds after. A man crouching down in a hospital corridor, gathering his documents, straightening them carefully, and then standing up and walking forward like the ground beneath him was perfectly solid. That image stays with me, because I think most of us, in that moment, would have done something different. Raised our voice, walked out, demanded an apology in front of everyone. And honestly, any of those responses would have been understandable. What Calvin did instead was harder. It required something that doesn't come easy. The ability to feel something fully and still choose your next move with a clear head. There's a word I've been reaching for, and I think it's integrity. Not the poster-on-the-wall version of it. The real kind. The kind that holds its shape when nobody's watching and nothing's going your way. Calvin didn't perform composure that morning. He lived it. And the difference between those two things is everything. What Roger Peel did, and had been doing, to people with less protection and fewer options, for years, was a kind of violence that institutions make possible when they stop asking hard questions about themselves. It didn't come from nowhere. It came from a culture that had learned, slowly and over a long time, that certain behaviors carry no cost. Calvin understood that. He'd worked in enough hospitals to know that one incident, managed in isolation, changes nothing. So he waited. He documented. He built a case not just against one man, but against a system that had let that man operate unchecked for 2 decades. That's not patience in the passive sense. That's intelligence used deliberately. The kind that asks not just what happened, but why it kept happening, and what would actually have to change for it to stop. And then there's what Jerome said to him in that hallway in April. That must have been hard. And Calvin said, simply, yes. I think about that exchange a lot. There's something important in a person who can hold their own difficulty plainly, without minimizing it or making it into a performance. Calvin didn't pretend the first day was easy. He didn't reframe the slap as a gift or a test or a lesson he was grateful for. It was what it was, hard, wrong, and he kept going anyway. That's the part I find myself returning to. Not the resolution, the boardroom, the dismissal, the policy changes, the green shoots outside his office window in May. Those things matter. But what made them possible was the decision Calvin made in that corridor, in the seconds after the sound of it faded. The decision to keep going, to stay deliberate, to not let someone else's worst behavior determine the terms of his response. I think that's what most of us are actually being asked every time something unfair happens to us. Not to be unaffected, not to pretend it didn't sting, but to decide, in the moment that follows, who we want to be in this story, and then to go be that person, quietly, consistently, in the hallways and the cafeterias and the corner offices, where no one is watching, until the building itself starts to feel different. That's the work. It doesn't always look like anything from the outside, but it adds up.